All right, joining me now is Ben Freakley, and he is a former American Lieutenant General. He commanded the 10th Mountain Division in Afghanistan in 2005. He is a professor of practice of leadership for Arizona State University. So that's the official title, Ben, but I have known you for a long time, including in Iraq when you were commanding some of the, or you were deputy commander of the 101st Airborne, I think, under General Petraeus. You have
Correct.
a lot of combat experience.
Well, there's plenty of soldiers with more than me, but okay.
But okay, when I used to sit around with soldiers and they talk about commanders, they would say, Ben Freakley is one of, and I don't know how best to characterize it, but he is not sitting in the planning office. He is a real boots on the ground general, and he knows how to take it to the enemy, and a very tough commander. Very tough commander, in a good way for American forces, but tough to the enemy. So let's talk about the enemy. You see this peace process now, the peace process with the Taliban. Are you hopeful? Are you skeptical? How would you characterize how you're feeling?
Well, I mean, I think any soldier and any leader that served and had the honor to serve with our soldiers is always hopeful for a peace process. You know, Clausewitz said that war is an extension of politics by other means. And so because politics and governments fall apart, it leads to conflict, but all conflicts lead back to some kind of peace process or some kind of resolution. I mean, I've always been optimistic and hopeful that we would get to peace because that meant that our soldiers were out of harm's way, both our American soldiers, but as importantly, our coalition soldiers who've given so much, and you and I were together, and our NATO forces were shoulder to shoulder with us in Afghanistan when I was there, and have continued to be. So I would, as a soldier, you always want to get to peace as soon as you can. This process is extremely complex because you said, let's get to the enemy. So Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iranian influence, who do you want to pick? So we've picked, our government has picked the Taliban to deal with. And I think it's a very complex deal that's been struck, mostly in favor of the Taliban, to the disadvantage of the standing government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan,
What do you say?
Ghani and his team, who were excluded initially, but perhaps that's the only way the Taliban would deal, so we dealt with who we could deal with. But I think that it's been tough. You know, it's been 6 months now. You see the Ghani government most recently with this very difficult decision on the 400 arguably sensitive political prisoners and operational prisoners that Ghani felt like he had to have a Laura Jirga to get the upper leadership to vote. They did, and they let him loose. But then on the heels of this 300 prisoner escape from Nangarhar, which is concerning. So you've got 700 operatives out on the battlefield, besides the 5,000 that Ghani had already released. To the Taliban's release of about 1,000, many have argued that they're sort of farmers that were rounded up and then let loose to swell their numbers. I don't know. I'm not on the ground, Dana. I'm sitting here in Virginia.
You were on the ground. Who were you fighting? Who is the Taliban?
Well, as you know, it's a mix. It is forces that were formerly under Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. He's been reconciled, now dead. It was forces clearly under Haqqanis out of Pakistan and the Haqqani network, and it's those out of Kandahar, Helmand, Uruzgan complex that were Mullah Omar's loyal soldiers. So I believe it's a mix, but I also believe that some of these casualties are also, and it's open reporting, are being caused by ISIS, and in some cases motivated by Al-Qaeda to keep at least the embers warm, the recruitment up, and the pressure up.
Are you surprised at the resilience of the Taliban?
No. I'm not at all, because they were resilient when we were together, when you were with us, when the 10th Mountain had forces there. There are plenty of young men disillusioned and out of work, both in Pakistan and Afghanistan, that are ripe for recruitment. And across the Middle East, there's and even Uzbekistan and other areas, Chechnya, that can be recruited, foreign fighters come and fight. So no, as long as there's money involved and there's a purpose behind the work, and the way in which the United States has failed to have a consistent strategic message across multiple administrations that we're there to stay, and we're going to see it through, and we're going to go from a military involvement to a diplomatic solution and help build a government that produces better support for the Afghan people. I'm not surprised the recruitment whatsoever.
A lot of people that I talk to, when they say, why are American forces still in Afghanistan? And I tell them, well, from the beginning, there wasn't a hill to take. And there wasn't a strategic objective in terms of something geographic. It was after 9/11, American forces went in there to dislodge Al-Qaeda that was using Afghanistan as a launch platform. The Taliban were given the option then, give up Al-Qaeda, or U.S. forces will deal with you as well, which is exactly what happened. But the Taliban fundamentally, do you think that they can be moderate, that they can suddenly power share with the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and all the different ethnic groups in there? Because I don't think those groups do.
No, that gets to my comment. I mean, you were on the ground early in after American forces entered in 2001. You've seen the long history of this, but prior to U.S. involvement, the warlords had broken Afghanistan apart. It never really was a homogeneous country. Even in the time of the kings, the tribes basically elected a king and put that king nominally in charge.
But U.S. forces, sort of, to interrupt the history there a little bit, but the U.S. forces and commanders like yourself were incredibly successful in going to those warlords. And we saw it on the ground where they said, give up your weapons, disband your militias, come together in a unity government. And in fact, I don't necessarily think all of them did, but I mean, the vast majority of the big kingpins did, and they were operating in that government system.
Right. And they participated, even those that were reluctant and held some of their arms back, still participated because they were included by all of us, and they wanted to be included. But I think with this ebb and flow of we're going to be there, we're going to leave, we're going to support, we're not going to support. I think in large part the Afghan people are just completely war weary and want it to be over. And part of their trust is now being ceded to the Taliban versus the Ghani government. And they certainly don't see a strong international military, economic, informational and diplomatic effort coherent to stay with them until the end. And I've always used the analogy that if there's a strong policeman on your block every day, you trust that policeman because she or he are going to show up every day. But if that policeman just comes in for a half an hour and says, hey, who are the drug pushers or who are the people that are committing criminal acts, you're not going to tell them anything, and they're going to leave, and you're going to go back to having to deal with the miscreants, as the Pakistanis would say, that are in the area. And so the Afghan people are trapped between what's the future really hold, what are the Taliban selling? But to your point, can the Taliban be moderate? I don't know. And the only reason I say there's a chance,
I'll answer it for you,
is over economics.
they're not gonna be moderate. But
the only reason I say there's a chance is over economics, because it's one thing for the U.S. forces to pull out, and the Secretary of Defense just said they're going to move another 3,000 plus out by November, conditions based, but nobody knows what the conditions are. And if you're conditions based and you're looking at what's happening in Afghanistan, you'd say the conditions are pretty bad. And if you look at what's happening with Iran and you're looking at what's happening with Pakistan, you might want to leave a strategic capability there to hedge the bet as the West, not going alone with the U.S., but NATO itself has invested so much, you might want to sustain the investment. But
and Americans have invested blood on the ground, and there are a lot of young men who fought to stand up an independent Afghan government to try and get the country up and running. And it's a tragedy if their legacy is that the Taliban are just returned to power and the country splinters again.
That's why I want it to work. I mean, I personally lost 73 members of my team, and I think about them all the time. And every time anniversaries come up of a loss, I think about And I've been to Arlington and seen where they're laid to rest in Mars Part. And sometimes my wife and I talk to the widows. And, you know, to your point, 2,400, over 2,400 have lost their lives, and then 20,000 have been killed, have been wounded. And then that doesn't count for the coalition. I mean, the Brits are allies. You know, all our NATO team members have lost one or more, some in the hundreds. And you're exactly right, Dana. It will be in vain if it falls apart. And that's why it's in our best interest to stay there, to stay with the strategy of there, because the other part of it is, do we really want independent fighters to say we beat the Russians and then we beat the Americans in the West? We can beat anybody. We can go anywhere we want to. And as long as we're good, strong fighters, they won't stand it. But to finish my thought on could they be moderate, my only thinking of the possibility of it is over the economics. Because again, the Afghan people have seen what the economics have done, creeping a very strangled society economically forward a bit. If the Taliban loses the economics behind it, they'll be in power a short period of time, and then there'll be some other kind of civil war. But I think the only hope is the economics, diplomatic and economically. But short of that, will they be ruthless? Will they be completely without law other than Sharia law? Absolutely. I'm not naive about that.
Do you draw any parallels between what's happened in Iraq and allowing the army to fall apart and you know, a caliphate to be struck at one point? And you can kind of look down the road and say, if U.S. troops pull out of there and allow the Afghan government to fall, there's some pretty big dangers ahead.
I think there's several dangers. Number one, if the U.S. doesn't and the West don't get this right, this failed state reoccurring is highly probable. Secondly, if the military does fall apart, then you've got all those unemployed men that were in the Afghan security forces, police or army. Now they're unemployed, rich for recruitment. We already know that ISIS is in there in large numbers. So and if the Taliban want financial resources, and the West pulls out economically, someone's going to fill that void economically, whether it's rich oil sheikhs or whether it's Putin or whether it's Iranian, but someone's gonna fulfill that void, both with violence and with economically, and we're going to be right back into a pretty bad situation.
You mentioned Putin. My last question, there have been reports that bounties were put out on U.S. soldiers by the Russians. Would you comment on it?
Well, number one, I don't live in a classified world anymore. I only read what's in open source, thanks to great journalists like yourself that actively report on it. But I'll just say this. Many of the leaders in the Afghan National Army had served as younger men with the Russians and for the Russians. I won't say who, but I was once with a senior Afghan general on the battlefield, and we were talking about a fight to come, and I mentioned that his Afghan corps commander I thought was a good soldier, and he said, yes, he's a good Russian soldier. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, when I was fighting with Ahmad Shah Massoud, we attacked Bagram, and the guy defending it was that guy with the Russians, and we beat him. But he was a good Russian soldier then, and he's a good soldier now. So just from experiences like that, I have to believe that there are still ties from those men who had relationships with the Russians during their time of occupation. And do I believe it's feasible for the Russians to come back in there with funding and pay people to act as mercenaries and kill American soldiers? I absolutely believe it. Now, whether or not they did that, I have no proof whatsoever. But from my own experiences there and my own belief, is it feasible? Absolutely.
And you would expect your commander-in-chief to take a pretty tough line on that?
On many things with regarding Russia. Our whole diplomatic corps and our again, whole of power government, our ability with informational power, economic power, military, and political power to put pressure on Putin to stay out and to not influence it, and get the data and the facts that if indeed the Russians have been in there doing that, there'd be some pretty serious sanctions about that.
Ben Freakley, a former Lieutenant General who commanded many forces in many places, including 10th Mountain Division in Afghanistan. Pleasure to talk to you, sir.
And you, Dana. Thank you for all that you do.